Get started, you guys. Um, Hello, welcome. I would say for those of you just joining us for the first time, but this is our first time here in Bloomington. Books, booze, and brains in Bloomington. Too many B's for me. I know. Snaps to Bloomington, y'all. Bloomington. Good Lord. I need to get out of here. Oh, well, that works too. Our poor live stream. I will give it a moment for our live stream to catch up. Okay, yep, maybe. It confirmed on. That is a sound. Yes. Yeah. Y'all coming in 3 beers deep. That just woke you up. I don't know. Three Midwest beers is nothing for y'all. Okay, we're good. Okay, hello everybody. I will reintroduce. Hello everybody. Welcome to Books, Booze, and Brains in Bloomington for the first time on the road. Woo! We are excited to be here. We are excited to be invited to kind of kick off this Granfaloon Festival. For those of you joining us on the live stream and normally who join us in Indianapolis, may be worth a trip down to Bloomington next weekend to join us for the Vonnegut Festival for the Granfaloon, kicking off with a series of wonderful events that you can find online. June, I believe, 1st through 4th, and there's a concert on June 4th. So if you are into returning to the festivities post-pandemic, maybe worth a weekend trip next weekend for y'all in Indianapolis. But for here, us in Bloomington, I'm excited to be talking with you about this Galapagos, which is the theme, from what I understand, for the entire Vonnegut Festival this year. Before we get started on this discussion with this wonderful book, I would like to go ahead and thank all the people who helped make this possible. Indiana Humanities, Indiana Sciences, obviously the Granfaloon Festival for inviting us and allowing us to read this book and participate in this discussion. The Indianapolis Public Library, all of our public libraries, honestly, y'all just deserve all the thanks. And to everybody who made this possible, so thank you. And with that, for those of you who don't know me, who have the fortune of not knowing me, my name is Allison Essex, and I will be guiding you through this journey of a book. We were just talking about this. I think halfway through, I finally appreciated and realized I liked it. I think, I think the first half of the book, I looked insane trying to explain to my poor partner what was going on. What are you reading? What is it about? I don't know. I really don't actually know what's happening. And I hope at least one person in this room can commiserate with me and understands that experience. And to help guide us through this discussion of this slightly confusing but very interesting and fun book are our two wonderful guest experts who I will allow to introduce themselves because you probably know yourself better than I do.
So I'm Roger Hangotter. I'm a biology faculty member here at IU. My area of research is actually plant biology. I do plant physiology research in the laboratory and greenhouse and growth chambers and that sort of thing. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I've been doing biology work for a very long time, since I was a little tyke. And so I've picked up quite a bit, so I understand evolution because it's fundamental to everything that happens in biology. But that's my background is in that. I teach plant physiology. That's the main course I teach. I've never taught evolution. I just talk about it. But the Vonnegut book, Galapagos, was probably my favorite Vonnegut book, partly because of the subject matter, because it is all about evolution and biology in so many ways and on so many levels. And it's a particularly profound book in light of what we're facing in the next, who knows, couple years maybe. Something's going to happen, I think. That's my prediction. But that's who I am. I hang out a lot in the woods, see and watch biology in action, trying to figure out what it really needs to work. And that's influenced how I think about where we're going down the road. And we'll talk about that more later.
Absolutely. Thank you.
How far away? I'm afraid I'm going to fall down here if I taking over. Roger didn't mention that he's a fantastic photographer, so I would really encourage you to check out his personal site. There's, is it still up? Yeah. So you find everything from photos of cows, and he can talk endlessly about how each cow has its own individual face and so forth. I heard him say that once. But there's also slow motion videos, films about plants and plant development and so forth. So I would really recommend that. And that's how I met, how came to know Roger in the first place, because my name is Christopher, I'm sure my interest is in natural history, art of natural history, anything that's related to representations of nature over the centuries, those types of things. I'm nominally in the English department here at IU, but I do all sorts of things that are not related to what I'm supposed to do. I also direct the Wells Scholars on campus. I've written about, as I said, natural history, Charles Darwin, Louis Agassiz, Charles Darwin's great and rather compromised opponent, those types of things. So I'm sort of at the borderline between history of science and literature. And Vonnegut, I've taught this book a number of times in freshman classes, and that's probably the reason why I'm here.
Well, thank you. And I, as we go through this, I know I will be thanking you as we go, but thank you for bringing your expertise to this book. And so I'm glad you have taught through this book, because as I mentioned, this was quite a whirlwind. Is this style of writing unique to Vonnegut? And is there like a name for this, or is it just blanket confusion?
I would not call it confusion. It's deliberate befuddlement, I guess, that he wants to create in his readers. There's a serious purpose behind that. Generally speaking, many of you know about Vonnegut and know sort of key themes in his work. I would probably describe him as a kind of dark satirist. Somebody uses satire to make a point, to make a serious point, and to teach us, to provoke a kind of reaction from us. So if you're confused, if you feel like various parts of this book don't follow in the sequence that you would expect them to be in, it's for a reason. Some of you probably have read Cat's Cradle. I saw someone had a T-shirt. When you, right, there you go. When you open Cat's Cradle, like right on the first page, he says, nothing in this book is true, right? So there's several ways you can respond to that, but probably the ideal way would be to say, well, there might be something that is true, to kind of resist the force of that statement. And that's what Vonnegut likes to do. He's very funny, and there are very funny parts in Galapagos as well. I love his definition of a cigarette, a fire at one end and a fool at the other, which is probably something that you've come across, right? I don't want to insult anybody who's a smoker here. Vonnegut was a smoker himself, you know, and a very passionate one, actually. So you find these statements throughout his book, but they are there to elicit something from you. And Galapagos is, in a way, the chronology, which is probably the most challenging part of it. It's really meant, first of all, it's confusing and it's funny to see that, you know, to look at a character and know that character's going to die. It's funny in a sort of dark way, because most of the characters who are going to die in the book are unappealing ones, right? And you find yourself confirmed in your sense that maybe this is not a character you want to spend the rest of the book with. But at the same time, it also troubles a sort of sense that we have a chronology. Chronology in various ways. I spent the last week reading books about dinosaurs. Don't ask me why, but I kind of got into it. And when you read books about the rise and fall of the mammals, for instance, surviving the dinosaurs and so forth, you always get a sense of neat chronology. The authors always want to tell you, okay, this is not about us. This is about something very different. But in a way, it becomes about us. It becomes about that moment where these tiny little mammals survive the asteroid hitting the Earth. And at the end of that long chain are we. the pinnacle, right? We are the only species that can actually contemplate our own origins, to think about our own origins. Now, Vonnegut comes ahead and gives us something that's completely jumbled, where the future becomes the past in a way, and we are back to sort of a pre-historic state in a way. Troubling chronology, troubling teleology, troubling the sequence of things as they should be, does something to us when we read the book. We find us in a state where we don't know, are we in the present, are we in the future, are we in the past? Do all these things become the same? So there is a darker and deeper kind of point, a more profound point that he wants to make. This is just one example, confusing us so that we take a step back and look at ourselves and go like, really? Is that who we are? So that's how I would explain the kind of style. And what Vonnegut does in a sense is like throw sentences at us, often very short ones.
Yes.
And we are supposed to like take a step back and think about them. Almost like that on my t-shirt, which is a coincidence that I actually put that on. A chocolate will save the rainforest. You go like, what? How? Why? That's sort of a Vonnegutian, if this adjective exists, way of making us think about literature, think about writing. And maybe sort of just about his career a little bit, which is sort of an important point to make too. He was not, literature is not something that he took for granted. Vonnegut had a very complex life. It involved being a car dealer at one point, selling Saab cars on Cape Cod when no one wanted Saab cars. So in a sense, having tried so many things makes writing for him both a difficult thing to do, but also something that he must do. So he puts himself into these books in various ways, and we will find him in Galapagos as well in different guises, and we can talk about this later.
Absolutely, thank you.
Sorry, that was a little long, but.
No, that's great to get the background on him. 'Cause for me, and I don't know if anybody else, this was my first Vonnegut work that I had ever read. Maybe because I'm new to the state of Indiana, I did not know it was a rite of passage for Hoosiers to read a Vonnegut piece. So this was my first. So I'm grateful for that background. So Roger, I would like to hear your input. A lot of this, the entire book, it's in the Galapagos, and it focuses on Darwin and his work and this idea of natural selection, survival of the fittest, and we're challenging that throughout the book. You see this challenge. But what exactly is the idea of survival of the fittest, natural selection in Darwin's works? Like, what is that actually?
So the survival of the fittest has to do with your DNA sequences and what traits those DNA sequences encode. And if you have genes that allow you to find what you need in the environment, sense the parameters of your environment and react appropriately to those changes in the environment or daily events in the environment, you have a better chance of surviving than if you don't. So if you lost all of your sensory input, you'd be lost. You wouldn't make it. No organism could make it. So a lot of these things that he refers to, that Darwin talks about, applies to every living thing. So the smallest bacteria, they have to sense their environment and be able to maximize the access to resources and do all of these things, just like us. The difference is we have a big brain. As Vonnegut reminds us over and over again in that book, and I think it's really appropriate that he does remind us that we have the big brain, because that big brain allowed us to do so many things no other organism on the planet has ever done. And this takes us down another part of evolution. So during evolution, mutations occur and so on, and some of them are good, they help you, some of them don't. Some of them will be neutral, so they may not actually impact your ability to survive under a particular set of conditions. But very many organisms have disappeared over evolutionary time. Huge numbers of organisms have disappeared over evolutionary time. Today, we're seeing them disappearing at alarming rates. And why today are they disappearing at alarming rates? It's because we are destroying their ecosystems. so that we can have stuff. And this is something that the big brain has led us to think that we deserve to have stuff, more stuff than any other living thing, that we deserve to be separate from nature, and that gives us provenance to do anything we want. And we just keep doing it. And it's just a terrible thing. But the natural selection is, your environment will change over time. Other organisms will change over time in your ecosystem. There's always going to be competition because life is, you get born, you try to survive until you don't, right? During that time, you hope you reproduce. That's the other imperative. So this is all stuff that every living thing has to cope with. And that stuff will change because some organism may get a disease and die off, and you were dependent on that organism. Now you have to adapt. And if you have the genetics to allow you to adapt, you can move forward in time. If you don't have the genetics that allows you to adapt to that one change or maybe multiple changes, you don't move forward in time. Mm-hmm. It's really quite simple. And it's quite extraordinary that, Darwin pieced this together from just watching the world and observing so many things. He didn't really do experiments until long after he had figured all that out.
Is there any significance to this book taking place in the Galapagos?
Oh, yeah. So islands are a classic example of where evolution is often studied because these islands are completely isolated, and especially a volcanic island. It comes up out of the ocean, right? So there's nothing there. It's just hot lava, not a living thing on it. And now you have to go through this whole succession as life finds its way there, usually with something that can float in the air, like spores or bacterial spores or moss spores, fungal spores. They can float all over the globe in the atmosphere because they're so light. Maybe even spiders. Spiders can shoot up a thread and be lifted by the wind, and they can go, hundreds of thousands of miles.
That's
stay
terrifying.
up. They can go up to 30,000 feet. So all these, the air is just filled with stuff. So, this a little aside, everybody thinks that, GMO foods are bad because you're eating, strange DNA. You breathe in so much DNA every day from so many different organisms that you don't even know exist. And you don't ever think about that and freak out until you get COVID and then you're sick,
Or until I hear you say that.
Yeah. So, the world is full of DNA. It's every place. Yeah. In fact, there's a recent study. I'm going off tangent here, but I do that. You said in your thing that you go off tangent. So, there was a recent study where two different groups independently came up with this idea that if they could just capture air, just bring air in, filter it, and collect the DNA in the air, they could tell you what species are living in that area. And they did this around a couple of zoos, and they matched everything. So now this is a new tool for scientists to go out into an ecosystem and get a census of the ecosystem just by sampling what DNA is in the air. So they were getting human DNA, they were getting all the mammals, everything, except for fish.
Well,
because they don't breathe into the air. So their DNA doesn't generally get up there. But it is a pretty extraordinary thing. But science is impressive when you understand how what the rules are and how it all works.
Yeah. Well, so you said, yeah.
Perhaps about the Galapagos, a little note. Vonnegut had traveled there himself 3 years before he wrote the book. And when you read Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, it's actually not that kind of heroic account of, getting there and noticing stuff right away. Actually, it's full of dumb things that he did. He got on top of a tortoise and knocked on the shell and fell off, and grabbed one of the lizards, threw it in the water to check if it could swim. And the lizard kept getting out of the water, running away, hiding in the ferns, hoping that Darwin wouldn't find it. He pulled the tail of a lizard, trying to see if the lizard would respond, and the lizard looked back and said, something Darwin imagined. Why did you do that? So really, the strangest thing on those islands was Charles Darwin, and all that it kind of conveyed to him was what happens when you introduce a foreign element in an environment where living things have never seen anything like you, right? the sort of eureka moment came much later, when he was back in England and was looking at those birds, and he needed the help of John Gould, was the keeper of birds at the London Zoological Society, to help him figure out what he'd actually seen. And Gould kept saying, Darwin, why did you not collect things in a better way? Because his data were really insufficient. And so that's kind of, it's really a funny narrative in a way, and Vonnegut, I'm sure, responded to that. When Darwin shows up in the book on T-shirts or on a bedspread or whatever, he's a popular icon, but it's a narrative of the kind that Vonnegut rejects, the heroic narrative of Darwin coming, seeing things, conquering, taking things back with him. None of that actually did happen in 1835 when he went there. And the funny thing is that when you talk about the Galapagos, ever since then, there's no way around Darwin. You have to cope with Darwin. So in a sense, Vonnegut is responding to that with his novel.
Yeah, thank you. So I was talking with you all earlier. I came from University of Miami, Florida. I had so many friends who were marine scientists, marine biologists, all took time to study in the Galapagos, but nowhere did anyone tell me the realities of Darwin's history on the Galapagos. And I had no idea, but that is, I think, important context for this book. So thank you. I'm actually about to turn, for those of you here joining us here in Bloomington, I'm about to turn the discussion onto you, and with what we call a turn and talk. And if you're joining us on the live stream and you're joining us from Indianapolis, you know exactly what's about to happen. So this, a turn and talk, is where you will turn and talk to each other, probably those people at your table who are closest to you. I will give you a question for you all to talk amongst yourselves, probably about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and you guys can report out. I don't want it to sound like fancy or like obligatory, but I figured some of y'all will come up with something good that you would like to share with the class, share with the group. And then we will talk for those on the live stream. We will shut off the speakers so you do not have to try to tune us out. This idea of natural selection and survival of the fittest, to me, reading through this, not everything can be attributed, at least in my mind. Everything, think of every trait of every living thing on planet Earth. Let's limit our discussion to planet Earth because I don't know if we want to talk about Mars. Does everything help us survive? Are there things that are just happenstance? Can we think of a trait as a group that maybe, does this really help that animal to survive? And like, Vonnegut opines that our brains maybe are not helping us survive and that maybe our brains are just too much. So are all adaptations, are all selective traits beneficial to survival? Can we think of examples where they maybe aren't? This is something I thought about for a long time, which is why I'm making y'all think about it right now in this turn and talk. I'm gonna give y'all about 10 minutes and it's gonna be kind of awkward at first. You can introduce yourselves if that would, maybe introduce what beer. I'm assuming you all got the limited run Galapagos beer, but if you are like me and allergic to pineapple, maybe you didn't. So I'll give you all 10 minutes and have fun thinking of every animal, plant, creature, and human, and everything that makes them that animal, which you would probably be the best at. So the live stream will be able to hear us.
So we should probably turn it off, right?
It'll just be...
Okay, so we should also answer that question, right?
Yeah.
As being superfluous.
I'm just hard-pressed to believe that every adaptation that has ever appeared on planet Earth are all beneficial to survival.
Right.
Okay, fair.
The other is until there's a real serious selection pressure. So
Okay.
you can have, so an example that I remember from I took this course in genetics. They told us about this debate was about this population in the Philippines. Some places South America that had 6 fingers. So they had an
Okay.
extra finger. And they were fine. They could still function and do all their things, and they survived. And the debate was, what kind of selection pressure would have done that?
Yeah.
Well, it's possible none. I mean, because it didn't impact their ability to, collect food and farm and do the things that they needed to do.
Yeah.
But there could have been selection that we didn't know about.
Okay.
Maybe I suggested this and got beat down by the professor, but maybe, like in lots of animals, like the peacocks with the showy tails and so on, it's the showiness is what attracts the female, tells them that they're in better health because they can support this big tail and stuff. Maybe having 6 fingers was something that the females in that particular society thought was great.
Why not?
So it could have been a selection to maintain that, but it could have just been a neutral trait that didn't have a severe enough negative impact that they could still survive.
I see.
So survival in nature is really that. Is it, can you make it through to the next generation? Can you reproduce?
Okay.
And so, you can have an incidental mutation that makes it impossible to reproduce.
Yeah.
Right? So
Well,
you're not going to, you
yeah.
might survive until
Yeah,
the end
but
of your life, but you may not be able to pass on that
it won't
DNA. So
move on.
most mutations that are detrimental, they may not be the detrimental things that, you just immediately die. They're just things that weaken you or do something so that over time it's unlikely that you're going to have the reproductive
I see.
propensity is something that's doesn't have those mutations.
Yeah. And the example that comes to mind, well, in the book, he comes up with, I think it's the something chorea, the late onset, like Parkinson's-like disease, Huntington's.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking of like these late onset age-related diseases. You wouldn't know in your reproductive years, and that wouldn't necessarily be any selective pressure, really.
Well, over time there will be.
Okay.
Our world is different. Humans are working very differently
Yeah.
than organisms out in nature.
Yeah.
So we have access to tons of energy. No other organism on the planet has access to excess energy. Every organism on the planet survives from what it can find to eat until it can't.
Yeah.
But with humans, we go out there and we drill all this oil. And, you look at our medical industry, that's entirely fossil fuel.
Oh, yeah.
Right? If it wasn't, we'd be eating bark and, rubbing solids from leaves on our skin or something when we have an issue and hope that maybe it does something. But, we can maintain people in our population that would not be able to survive outside of our society because we have excess energy.
Yeah.
It's really the one thing that separates.
One thing to remember too is when we talk about the pressure of natural selection is that the limits of our perception as humans. So there are things that we might not understand, or they will make sense at some point, but not now. I incidentally think that Vonnegut is wrong about the dance of the blue-footed boobies because he says that, essentially it serves no real purpose. It's boring. It goes on forever. But we do know that the color blue has an important evolutionary purpose. And the dance allows the male to display the degree of blueness, which is an indicator of fitness and reproduction. And females make a selection based on that. So he presents this as sort of a boring kind of, or the narrator does. But I think it's important to realize that evolution is not a straightforward progressive force. It can go backwards. Darwin writes about this in Origin of Species. The blind cave-dwelling insects in Kentucky, where there's a crab that he writes about that goes blind and still has like the eye stalks left, but no eyes. The eye stalks, there's no need to get rid of them because they don't hinder survival at this point, right? Maybe some generations in the future will be gone, but the limits of our perception of what's happening in nature is one of the great themes of Darwin. These things happen without we are not needed for them to happen. We are not needed to observe them.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the great insight of Darwin's book. So some things might seem nonsensical to us
Yeah.
and superfluous. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. I mean, in us, wisdom teeth is an example that's usually mentioned, the appendix.
Oh, yeah. Oof.
But, you know, they don't hinder our survival.
No.
It's just not necessary to get rid of it, if I understand this correctly at this point. I mean, wisdom teeth can impact, like formation of teeth, right, at some point, in which case they need to be taken out, but still.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of things that, you know, we can't know necessarily when something is going to be of critical importance for survival of this species.
Yeah.
We know about it after the fact, and then we try to figure out, well, why did that happen?
Yeah.
And you have to take it in the context of the entire ecosystem. So much of evolutionary biology is looking, you know, right now it's focused on the DNA sequencing, using that as their tool. But when you want to understand, well, why is this gene so important, then you have to get into the mechanistic question.
Yeah.
There's different aspects of science.
Yeah.
And when you understand, you know, like, oh yeah, they were missing a particular enzyme that allowed them to be able to digest cellulose, which they can't anymore. Now, life becomes a little more precarious, and you're dependent on some other organisms that can digest cellulose.
Yeah.
Like ruminants.
Yeah.
So they can't themselves digest cellulose. They have bacteria in their guts that do it for them.
Yeah.
And if something were to happen to those bacteria, you know, both organisms would disappear.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So there's this cascading impact oftentimes that one organism disappears, and all of a sudden, you know, you have this situation where you're impacting other organisms around you. So there's always a ripple effect. The idea, you know, the butterfly flies and the wings disturb everybody. You know?
Yeah.
This is really true. You know, maybe not in a way where it's disruptive, but it's an impact. And there's ripple effects of everything.
No, I mean, it's one of the, you know, something to remember about this book is that Vonnegut really had aspirations to do both science and literature. He wanted to, so the science is not just an incidental part of the book. He himself had a bit of a science background. He went to Cornell for a year, and his brother felt he should try and be a scientist. His brother was actually a physicist and a well-known one. He did some engineering later on. I think it was at the University of Tennessee. None of that worked out. He was a self-taught scientist in quotation marks. He did study anthropology, but he never finished. And one of the kind of amusing details is that I think it was 27 years after he was supposed to get his degree, he submitted one of his novels in lieu of a thesis, and that was Cat's Cradle, which was actually accepted by the faculty of the University of Chicago in lieu of a formal thesis that he, because at that point he was teaching creative writing, and his lack of a degree became a problem, you know. So he didn't have the credentials in a way.
Oh, that's cool.
So on the one hand, that kind of limits a little bit how we should look at the book. On the other hand, it also should encourage us to really take seriously what he's attempting to do. This was not just sort of a facile kind of thought experiment. And since you keep coming back to the big brains, I think one of the kind of really, to me, appealing things about this book is it criticizes the big brains, but it does so from a big brain's perspective, right? It does so from a perspective of someone who's done a lot of reading, who's done a lot of thinking. We know from his letters that he studied Darwin. Darwin was important in his family. He came from a family of freethinkers, and he emphasized that his uncle actually had read Darwin. It's in one of his, he gave a lot of graduation speeches, and I don't remember which one, but he actually talks about all of them. Very, very funny. So with Vonnegut, you're always at that point where you kind of have to figure out, you know, how does he mean something? For instance, thinking about natural selection, there's one statement by him that I love. He said, "I'd rather be a sea otter than a human being, even if there's another oil spill." So you go like, okay, you take the first part of the statement, rather be a sea otter than a human being, even if there's an oil spill, which kind of inserts that perspective into it where you think, okay, you shouldn't really be one, right? And he's aware of that too. So you always move in circles with him. And that's what Galapagos as a book does as well.
Testing.
Yeah, one of the things I really liked was, I didn't know, when I picked up the book to read, I did not know that it was going to be this exposition on Darwin and natural selection. And when I started reading, I go, this guy really knew his material. I mean, he did a huge amount of work.
Yeah.
And Christoph told us about it the other night, and when we did a thing at the Wonder Lab. And, I was really impressed because it was clear from the book that, and as a scientist reading it, that he knew his science. He wasn't faking it. And, Christoph explained how much research he actually put into it. And it's like, that makes total sense.
It's easy to think of him sort of as a Mark Twain figure, somebody who jokes all the time, but there's always a serious kind of undercurrent in his work. He always gets to a point where the laughter kind of stops. And we think, okay, what do we take away from that? One of the points that I tried to make when Roger and I did this event a few days ago, the final sentence of the book is, you'll learn. And that's the narrator is being told by a doctor, by a physician, you'll learn. And that's what we take away from it, to think about something. And one aspect that we haven't emphasized that we maybe should mention later on in the discussion too, there's a very strong, and for several decades in Vonnegut, very strong environmental commitment. He writes about this in the book, criticizing the guy who's organizing these nature cruises, who tries to sort of style himself as a conservationist, but is not. And Vonnegut, since the 60s, 70s, has been arguing against the things that we do to the environment in many ways. The contaminated soils, contaminated rivers, the air that no one can breathe. It's present in all of his books at a time when few other writers were making this such an important element of their commitments.
Is that part of what made him so popular?
Frankly, I think what made him popular is that he's funny and irreverent, and that he styled himself as somebody who would always say the things you weren't supposed to say.
Yeah.
And I remember there's a panel discussion I watched. It's like a YouTube video, and several writers are there. They're all talking about censorship and so forth. And then it's Vonnegut's turn, and he says, "No one's ever censored me. People don't read me. That's the problem." And this is exactly what he wasn't supposed to say. Everybody was expecting him, given his leftist commitments, to have a strong statement, against censorship. And he always does these kinds of things. And I think that made him popular with people, that, there's entertainment. There's a lot of funny passages in the novel. I mean, James Waite, the eviscerator of widows, as he calls him in the novel, he's a very funny character.
Oh, yeah.
Leaving sort of like a trail of women that he's built out of their inheritance,
Oh,
or their money. That's, it's very funny.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Ooh, thank you. Okay. Assuming this is on.
I laughed so hard reading this book.
Yeah.
For so many reasons. Some of it was the cleverness, just the
Right.
cleverness and the way he presented the science, and it just came across as, wow, that's genius.
Yeah. I think about the captain who has lost all his clothes and is like stark naked and doesn't know how to navigate a ship because he's never done it.
Oh, yeah.
It's like almost everybody else knows more about seafaring than he does.
Yeah, poor Mary knew more about driving that ship and navigating than the poor
Then he has
captain.
this great aristocratic name, von Kleist.
Oh, yeah.
He doesn't know squat about anything.
Truly. Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and bring us back. This is what I'm terrible at, keeping time. Okay. Ooh, I'm very loud, which, not new. Awesome. Well, hello. I hope you all came up with some. We had a great discussion. Would anybody like to share any trait, anything, really anything they talked about? If you went off on a tangent, you are in good company.
Thank you.
Yeah? Good tangents? I'm on board. It's on the live stream, so it won't be on the mic, but everybody online will be able to hear you.
We were thinking that our large brain make it too large to fit in our mom's pelvis, so we're born as huge that cannot take care of themselves for 29 years.
Facts. I'm going on 30 and
50,
mom,
50, 60.
no, straight facts. It's that big brain that we keep coming back to, that big, big, dummy, dumb brain. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but in many cases, those organisms are laying like thousands of eggs.
Which we don't.
Yeah.
Thank God.
Yeah. Yeah. The moms are going, oh, please, one was enough. Did anybody else? Is anyone else thankful for their mom right now? Yeah. 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 That's something that you had brought up in our discussion too.
Yeah, like tonsils. When I was a kid, every one of my classmates had their tonsils taken out. I just suffered sore throats on a regular basis. Our doctor said, no, that thing's pretty important. It wouldn't be there otherwise. He had no reason to say that, but but now people do believe that these things, you know, we can't know everything, especially about biology, because biology is so complicated. When you have millions and millions of cells in one human, and most of them aren't even human cells. There are microbes and other things that live in us. It's really, really hard to know all of the implications of each part of that system.
Absolutely.
And about the boobies, just sort of the blue-footed boobies, just one note. Vonnegut is kind of misrepresenting this a little bit because the dance does have a purpose. It does feature sort of the blueness of the male's foot, which is a criterion for natural selection. You know, females watch out for that because it's an indicator of male prowess, I guess, the blue color. But I think that that's a fantastic point. And it's difficult with Vonnegut to say whether he's serious or not, whether in this passage it just reflects Mary's sort of dumb way of anthropomorphizing the dance. Darwin did have moments where he looked at things and said, you know, what purpose does that serve? There's one letter to Asa Gray, botanist, a very impressive, powerful letter, where he says that he has difficulty believing in God in a world where cats play with mice. Just looking at the needless suffering that, and you know, there are probably cat owners here, that cats inflict on mice when they are kind of paralyzed, half dead, and the cat still plays with them. And Darwin is basically, the implication is they learn nothing from that. They know how to kill already. But that's just needless suffering. And I look at that and I go like, why? Pointless. Whoa.
The table in the back. Are we on blue? Are we on brain? We're keeping with the B's today.
Yeah. So the one that our table ended up liking brains, specifically like the relationship between taste and the brain.
Yeah. We're talking Western diet.
Right. But like, I imagine, that desire for sugar is very helpful long time ago.
Yeah.
Problematic.
Yeah. For a number of reasons, and all of them, the Mars Company. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. At one point, maybe this trait, this selection, I think this was going to be something I was going to ask. To me, it seems like humans are the exception, not the rule, when we're talking about traits. With every other animal, every other living being, we can maybe think of, at one point, this was adaptive, or maybe not yet, but there will be, like in our discussion, there's a selective pressure. Maybe it hasn't happened yet, but that selective pressure might happen, and it will select for that trait. But it seems like, back to the big brain, are we not subject to those rules? And I think of this in the context of climate change. There will come a point where biologically, I feel like we are going to go through a selection process that our brains cannot engineer our way out of as we have thus far. And I mean, the book kind of gets in that, right? Like a bacteria that just, we can't reproduce. Nothing we can do, and we're undergoing a true biological selection event that I don't know has ever really happened with humans, or maybe it has.
Well, there have been biological selection events, things like the plague and so on.
True.
There have been many. There have been many societies that totally collapsed after they exhausted their resources, which any high school biology student knows you can't have continuous growth. You put a bunch of things in a petri dish or in some container and you give them ample food, they'll grow until it's gone and then they die. And the human big brain thinks that, no, that's not going to happen. We can have everything we want. And really, this sugar thing is a good one. I mean, you had to find food that had calories. And sugar is one form of calories that's all plants make. That's actually their primary job, is make sugars and then convert it to other things so that we get more than just sugar out of them. And with those kind of things, when we can make sugar in abundance now because we can fertilize the heck out of the sugarcane and sugar beet fields and extract sugar in huge quantities, it's now become like a drug more than it has become a nutrient. I mean, when you're dependent on food to live, you eat differently than we do, Having fire to help us cook food so we can get more nutrition out of the food is something that's really different. No other organism on the planet besides humans have tamed fire. We're the only organisms discovered that you can get fire out of certain rocks, coal, and out of this oil that comes out of the ground, and that gives us access to energy that no other organism has, just us. So we have been avoiding evolution for a few hundred years at least. Our generation time is pretty long, so evolution it's a slow process. And we have been avoiding it. We've been keeping around people that wouldn't be able to do traditional hunting and gathering kind of subsistence living. And at some point, it's going to crash.
Yeah.
I mean, it will. I mean, there's just no option. You can't keep doing what we're doing, which is taking from the environment for us and not giving anything back to the environment to grow new things.
Yeah.
It's a really sad state of affairs. We have the big brain. We can understand that.
Yeah.
Science is so good now, it can predict so many things.
Right.
We can send a spaceship to Jupiter by passing it around like 6 other planets multiple times and having it land at Jupiter on exactly the day we said it was going to land there. We can do so many things like that. We can see into the future, in a sense, because we now understand the basic laws of physics, chemistry, and biology enough that we can look in the future and say, the climate is changing because we keep extracting things from this planet to make stuff that you go buy at the shopping malls and things, the consumer economy. Even today in the paper, retail sales have gone up. The stock market went up today because retail sales have gone up. Retail sales, if it's food, which they don't really count as retail sales is the junk, the stuff that we put in the landfill after a little bit of time with us. And, we have avoided the evolutionary pressures that are there just waiting until we either run out of fuel or the resources to make the junk that we try to create our ever-growing economy out of. I mean, today, one of the biggest fears by economists is that our population is not increasing fast enough. Oh, yeah. Because that's going to impact the economy. The economy can't grow if your population doesn't grow. Mm-hmm. So they're proponents of continuous growth. Absolutely. Which is violating everything.
And I think the other question that Galapagos asks is culture. How important we produce culture. We don't have to wait for tools to become available. We make them. We compose symphonies. Beethoven's Ninth is the example that is constantly being alluded to. Architecture. Vonnegut's father was an architect. Art. How necessary are these things? He's imagining a society in which we don't have the hands to create anymore. And the part of the brain that controls the hands is gone. How the humanoids that the novel imagines, these sea-like figures, they don't create. They just lie around on the beach, which is funny, but it's also very disturbing. And it forces us to ask, do we need all these things? Do we need literature? This is in the form of a novel that he's asking this. These humanoids don't tell stories. They don't invent stories. They don't need stories anymore in their lives. But Vonnegut is a writer, and there's a sort of really complicated irony that this novel engages in by imagining a society that doesn't need exactly the kind of product that Vonnegut makes available to us.
I love that idea.
Of no literature sitting on
No, of Vonnegut sitting around going, I'm going to tell a story about not needing a story.
A group of people who are better off without stories, without art, without any of it.
But I also appreciate the culture thing, because culture that is something that humans have. Not very many other organisms have what you call a culture. You have society organisms, social organisms like ants and bees, and so on, that everybody has their assigned jobs and they follow the rules. And if they don't, one of the other guys eats them. Somebody eats them. But with humans, we make up our own rules as we go along. But, if you think about, so in 150 years, the last 150 years, lighting, that light bulbs weren't around that long ago, 1879 or something. The internet, we now have this collective brain, the Borg, like in Star Trek. Got to make sure I get my sci-fi right.
This is the wrong crowd.
So you have that, collective brain thing going on. And somewheres, I just read this the other day, that 17% of our population works in IT, information technology. But there's another 20% that work in maintaining the electrical grid, which is not information technology. So that's nearly 50% of our society is now slaves to this energy in ways that we don't even think about. We're doing these jobs, I get rich by doing this job, but what are you actually doing when you're doing that job? You're taking us another notch in what's called Muller's ratchet for evolution, which is there are these events that take place, like a genetic change, but eventually there's a selective pressure and it gets ratcheted, so you can't advance. But we have been avoiding the ratchet for, probably 1,000 years or more. So our evolution that's taking place has been pretty minor because we collect all of those genetic changes in the entirety of the global population, and we don't know what of those genetic changes is going to turn out to be of selective significance when whatever happens, happens. So in Galapagos, the economy collapsed. Why would the economy collapse? Just pick up a newspaper today. There's like a million reasons why our economy is going to collapse. Wars all over the place, starvation all over the place. We've become so dependent on that energy for everything. I was reading in some book the other day that every tomato you buy at the grocery store costs at least 3 to 4 tablespoons of crude oil to get it to you.
When that was,
Hard to believe.
and I think that's a great lead-in for this second turn and talk question. And it's something that I kept having to put, and I don't know if anyone else experienced this, regularly had to just put the book down because it, you talked about these short sentences that carry so much and are so weighted. I had to just stop, and you really have to stop and think, which is what I think makes it such a great and compelling book. And as was said earlier, really poignant, I think, for what's happening right now. It just gestures broadly everything globally, what's happening now, and even domestically. And so I wanted to take this turn and talk, and because there's levels of irony to this book, a lot of levels of irony to this book. But one of them is that this is a coffin of our own making, truly. Sure, the big brain at one point was beneficial, right? And we built our own tools, and we have avoided some of these pressures by navigating our way out of them, engineering our way out of them. We can thank these higher order processes and these neural networks for all they do for us. But we have also done this to ourselves to an extent. And we talk about climate change in particular, and we talk about the ecological collapse that we are in the middle of. And the book hints at this, leaders watching and leading into wars and just thoughtless, pointless killing. And at the time, in reference to Vietnam, which was referenced multiple times in the book, but from the point this book was published to now, we could think of dozens of other examples of just evil being, brought forth by people in power, and they talk about this. We talked about this with, fake environmental conservationists, the person in New York who came up with this cruise as an idea to be beneficial. He also references Macintosh. Oh, he's great. He's helping to advertise this environmental cruise and its conservation, and that's all good. But in reality, none of the other behaviors present in these characters really move in that direction and really contribute to that goal. And it just, I keep thinking back to we did this to ourselves. Truly none of this has to exist. And over time, it has just happened to us. And I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a cynical millennial that sees no future for myself and my fellow Gen Zers. But I wonder, as I read through this book, and the narrator makes it clear, the SEAL people are happy. They're sitting on a beach, basking in the sun, laughing at farts, and I'm sitting here in the Midwest, scraping ice off my car to go to work to not be appreciated. So I mean, like I said, cynical millennial, call me what it is. Would we be better off? Maybe I was kind of jealous. I'm not gonna lie. I was thinking back to some of the, wind chills and the negatives, and I was thinking, man, being a SEAL on a lava beach doesn't sound too bad. Maybe Vonnegut gets onto something here. And I feel like that is a thought better expanded on in a group with friends with alcohol. So I think that is appropriate to do now in our next turn and talk. And maybe you're not as cynical as me. Maybe you enjoy the big brain and you see a future. And for that, I salute you. But I think that is a good turn and talk prompt. So I will give you probably 10 minutes and then we'll come back and hopefully you can give me hope for a future.
I mean,
Okay.
Some people,
That's a
some
tall
people,
task.
some people already live like that.
Yeah, really.
You know, like sitting on the beach.
Well, people with the money to do so.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
And
the
I
money.
mean,
Yeah.
but how many other people, how many hundreds, thousands of people have to live a life of just absolute horrors?
Yeah.
And today, I'm not talking hundreds of years, I'm talking today, the
Yes.
subjugation
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
the majority of people will live under and they will never know. It I cannot, it's something I had to keep coming back to as I read through this book. And it was like, man, we could all just be SEALs and we could all be living in a much better way. And we just aren't. And I understand that is a loaded statement. It is a loaded concept to run back hundreds and thousands of years of systems and structure that our brains really like the organization and the structure and the rules. And it has been so twisted and mutated to a point that it is unfunctionable for a majority of people. It really does not function. Um, and I cannot get out of my head that like, yeah, we did this to ourselves. Maybe we deserve to be seals. Maybe he's onto something. I should be a fur seal baby on a Galapagos beach.
Well, the writers have always felt the temptation to kind of just, tell us to cut the crap. And one of the funniest moments in a novel that's not at all funny, Melville's Moby Dick, after 400, 500 pages of talking, the whale comes and takes Ahab, just like that. And Ahab doesn't even have a chance to say anything, right? It's just gone, right? And there's something really like appealing about sort of imagining like the end of all that chatter. You know, it's like, okay, degree zero. Yeah, Ahab just ends up tied to that whale. And Vonnegut has these moments too, you know, because this new society doesn't need birth control anymore.
Right.
The sharks just come out and take whatever they want.
Yeah.
You know,
Fair. Yeah.
limit population in the most kind of efficient way possible. The problem is that the only way out of this mess is using our brains again. Aldo Leopold in Sand County Almanac, he says the only way we can fix the situation we are in is to use a spade. You know, the spade did us in, and we need to use it to get us out of there. The problem is that no one's doing it, or people are not doing it the right way. And this is where Vonnegut, the moralist, comes in. He's not telling us to forget the big brains and to not at all worry about the future anymore, but look forward to a state of society where we're all basking in the sun. He's essentially saying, is this really what you want? Use your brains in the right way possible. It's the only hope we have. It's a feeble hope. It's a very small hope. That's why it's at times says I'd rather be a sea otter than a human being, right? But since I keep writing novels, since I keep, coming up with these stories, that's the reason why I'm doing that. And it's a dilemma that we can't get out of. Roger presented that dilemma on Sunday, I think it was Sunday, right? Really succinctly, that we know what's needed and we're not doing it.
Yeah, I mean, my generation grew up with parents that all wanted to make life easier for their children. This is what parents do, right? But it was the thing. It was what was talked about. It was what was on television. It was everything. It was parents, the father's going to sacrifice himself and work to, the crazy hours and so on. The mom's going to, take care of the house back then. That's how it worked.
So
but
that you have
but
it
it was
better
also
than we
that
did.
their children will have it better than, and look what we gave them. we gave them this desire gave everybody this desire to have more crap. And that's, it was wealth that was better.
Yeah.
Having more wealth was better, but that wealth wasn't anything. It was just this thing that Vonnegut talked about, this made up economy. And, we've been pursuing that for years. Back when Earth Day started in the 70s, I guess it was 1970, there was a lot of talk about zero population growth or trying to reduce the population size so that we could be sustainable, which is all really what needs to be done, because we can't sustain the population we have. It's just not going to happen much longer.
Yeah.
All of that is dependent on fossil fuels, our industrialized agriculture,
Absolutely.
our industrialized production of fertilizers, everything.
Yeah.
And at some point, it's going to collapse. And we're so unprepared. I mean, I am a plant biologist. I actually got a degree in horticulture when I started and switched to, other areas of plant biology, but I couldn't feed myself. I mean, I know in principle how to do it,
Oh, yeah.
but it's incredibly hard
No.
to do
Yeah.
that. And you need a pretty good amount of land to be able to feed a family of a few
Yeah.
people, and they all have to work on that land to
Oh,
do
yeah.
it. You don't get to rest.
Yeah.
So, without reducing population size, so this is, what do we do in the future? We have the smarts, we have the brains, we have the knowledge of the basic fundamentals of how life works in terms of biology, how physics work and chemistry. We can model these things.
Yeah.
And we could model a way to reduce our population over time so that we don't have a catastrophic starvation episode.
Well, yeah. And we're
But
not slipping into like eugenics territory.
Yeah. Well, this is where
and
the
forced
problem comes in, because
sterilization.
you run into the moral questions, the ethical questions
Well,
of
yes.
how do you reduce population
Yes.
size without
Forced
social
steriliza-
engineering
Yeah.
of
Yep,
some
yeah.
sort.
Right,
And now
yeah.
you enter a whole world of ethics that none of us are capable of coping with.
No. Which was
That's
an aspect. I understand the reproduction aspect of this book was crucial and is crucial evolutionarily speaking. Considering what's happening domestically with domestic policy with abortion rights and reproductive rights, I had to stop reading this book for a couple times, just for that reason alone. Maybe it's because I'm a young woman and that's just on my mind and it's at the forefront of everything I'm seeing. But that was terrifying, and to read this book and see that and have that all going on at the same. So, I mean, considering when this book was written and how relevant and how poignant it is, not just, today, this era, right now, this week.
Yeah. And it's going to be for a long time. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's really hard.
There's another aspect too. Thinking about culture again, if you take the Mandaraks in the novel and the maxims that the Mandarak spouts,
Oh, yeah.
help yourself and heaven will
Yeah.
help you, right?
Yeah.
All these kind of cultural things, that baggage that we have, that is completely irrelevant, that doesn't help us. He's also making a point of the kind of culture that we need, not the culture we can escape into and bask in sort of the beauty of it for, it's fine, but maybe we can't afford that anymore.
Yeah.
It's way past time to actually do something and not revel in mindless kind of cultural baggage that
Yeah.
it's also a point that he's really making about education. What gets conveyed to us in college.
Yeah.
This is a point that was made a long time ago by Thoreau, in fact, who's cited in the book, when Thoreau talks about people living lives of quiet desperation. And he's actually making a point about colleges. In 1854, he's saying, we don't teach our students anything that is useful. Colleges exist, Thoreau says in Walden, to amass money.
True.
And to essentially recycle that kind of wealth and increase it. And you don't learn anything. And that's true of higher education today. And that's a larger point that Vonnegut is making. The Ninth Symphony is great, and we need it in many ways, but we need it if it actually translates into action.
Absolutely. Yeah. And now that I've graduated, I can say that. I can say I agree with you.
No, it is. If you think about what do we teach in any university right now that is going to help people navigate this unbelievable future that's coming, that's so full of uncertainties.
No.
Even though we know these problems are coming, we can't seem to act on them. So what do? We still have a business school that teaches people how to market, how to sell garbage, so that we can accumulate it into landfills, and some people who run in those businesses will make money.
Yeah.
And it's, this is what we do. We're teaching people how to have careers that may not even exist in 5 years.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
We don't know what to predict. So why aren't we teaching people how to be adaptive? What kind of traits do you need to be adaptive in this,
Yeah.
what's coming? Lots. You need lots of
Oh,
traits.
yeah.
You need lots of skills.
And the irony is not lost on me that across that same campus, you have the environmental engineers, you have environmental policy, you have people actively fighting these same problems that are being propagated across the street. And it's not lost on me that exists in the same ecosystem, the same microcosm as functional, when in reality it's really not.
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to somebody talking about his research on, this is from the business school, on corporations that are starting to embrace using, solar,
Yeah. Oh,
carbon neutral
Right.
energy.
yeah.
And then how that correlates to their capacity to embrace energy efficiency. So in their products
Okay.
and the way they make their products and so on.
Yeah.
And after all of his research, the bottom line was simply that it all depends on what's most cost effective to the
Yes, that
corporation
bottom
in
line.
terms of satisfying the shareholders.
Yeah. Oh, that bottom line.
So-
Satisfying shareholders.
And as
I
long
know.
as we're locked into that kind of economic situation, we can't escape it.
We teach at a university that has made no commitment to divest from fossil fuels to this day,
No.
despite
And they
student
won't.
protests, despite faculty protests. It is not something that even needs to be argued that much anymore. But it's in a sense hopeless, and yet we have to keep on doing what we are doing.
Yeah.
There's no alternative.
No, we've built this for ourselves, and we're slowly adding the filigree, and we're setting the nails for ourselves. I mean, truly, that's how it feels as somebody coming into this, being like, oh,
Yeah.
I guess this is what it is now.
Yeah, I mean, the extent of the irony in the way we live is just crazy.
No.
Today there was somebody, I think it was on CNN, was confronting one of the Republicans about how in Texas, how willing they were and how rapidly they went after protecting embryos, unborn embryos,
Right.
and yet they won't take a single step in the direction of protecting that 10-year-old child
Yeah.
at school.
The nearly 24.
I mean, those kind of things just seem like, that should make you pause. And it didn't even create a blink in this person.
No, I think that's something that I've not, since that news broke of the school shooting in Texas, and coming to talk about this book and what this book is talking about and all the subject matter and what it's hinting at. That was not lost on me, and that was tough for me to grapple. And my partner's a high school teacher, and it's something I think about every day. And going through this book, another moment for pause, I think, for me in this book, and just having to put it down and go, this is not toying with the line of, yes, this is a fictional scenario in a fictional book, but God, does it feel real?
That's
I mean,
interesting.
absolutely.
When you think of the epigraph, which is actually quite powerful,
Mhm.
it said he's remembering Mr. Howie, who took him and other boys into nature, imitates a wildcat near the camp, and a real wildcat screams back.
Yeah.
That's a very touching fantasy. There's no coincidence. That's right at the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
So what Vonnegut is essentially telling us, this is a fiction, yet it's not.
Yeah.
Coming back to the sentence at the beginning of Cat's Cradle, nothing in this book is true. And yet, the truth is what I'm concerned with, right?
Yeah.
And one thing also to remember, this is an environmental apocalypse, essentially, but it's 1986.
Yeah.
Year after year, month after month, we keep talking about how the window for action is narrowing,
Yeah.
and we don't do anything.
No.
And this was 3-4 decades ago. Just think about that.
That's hard to believe.
Yeah, I mean, Earth Day was 1970, so a little
Yeah.
before. Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring had come out. It looked like there was going to be change. We embraced it. We supported it. We went
Yeah.
out and did our Earth Day things. We stopped flushing when you peed and all
Yeah.
that sort of stuff. And then 10 years later, we're slowly, that stuff gets beat out of the system.
Yeah.
You can no longer talk about zero population growth because that's amoral to think about that. And we just got, everything just got lost. And so as somebody who's, you know, the hippie generation, you know, the Woodstock generation and so on, who really embraced the whole, you know, save the planet thing. It's like at some point I fell asleep and then I wake up 40 years later and it's like, oh my God, we didn't do anything.
Yeah.
You know, my whole generation screwed it along with all the previous generations. But
I was gonna say.
and you know, now it's like, how do you get the next generation to actually pay attention to this?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it's really hard. I mean, students that I teach, some of them really want to see some kind of change, but they all still want that job
Right.
Well,
that's going to make them rich.
Oh, well, or even just survive at this point.
Well, many of them are still thinking, you know, they want to have a
Oh.
job where they get plenty of vacation time and they can travel the world
That's a different
and
process.
do all these things that, you know, we really shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. I think that's the cynicism in millennial Gen Z. Yeah.
One of the advantages of being a writer is that you can actually get back at people that you hate. He put William Buckley in the book. Who was a great conservative at the time. One of his
Oh, yeah.
opponents, you know, they sparred on television shows, and he's the guy who almost ended up being on a nature cruise.
Right.
But because he wasn't, we know he's dead. You know, so that to me is just fantastic.
There's so many clever things in this book. It's,
Oh, yeah. I feel like it's like a movie or a song you listen to again and again,
Right.
read it again and again.
Yeah.
You find pieces to appreciate every time.
yeah, I read it a few times, and when I heard you talk the other night, I was like, I missed that.
Yeah.
I missed
Oh, I know. I feel like I'm gonna have to go back and read this book just so I can catch even more things. So as we come back from this turn and talk, does anybody I don't know, maybe a show of hands is too bold. Did anybody decide to go the way of the seal, the humanoid seal? Nobody went the way of potentially? Maybe? No? Are we all team brain? We're all team big brain will get us out of here? I'm with it. I mean, I'm with team big brain. Does anybody have thought? Nobody picked the seal. Am I the only one? It's the Florida. It's the Florida coming out of me. I'm born to be a seal.
So what did you pick?
Yeah, what? Did we come with a middle ground?
Okay, so I started thinking the seal route, right? And I like the sound of that. But then I started thinking more our timeline, the age that we live in. And I would love to be a golden retriever owned by a couple of middle class white men.
Like what? I
A
couldn't hear
golden
that.
retriever owned by a middle-class white man.
Evolution, are you listening? Hello? Genetics? Fair.
Well, I like that idea because your humanoid is going to have to pick up your poop.
And Roger has a few things to say about poop. I heard him talk about it just a few days ago.
For another time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
About those tiny, tiny little bags that we put in the landfill.
Oh God, yeah, that's terrible. Nobody went to, golden retriever's a good option. Okay. That's fair. Yeah. The golden retriever's not making it past. Talk about natural selection. He ain't getting selected.
There is a dog in the novel, right?
Yeah,
'Cause
yeah.
True.
there's a
It gets
dog in
eaten.
the novel, and the dog doesn't make it.
Yeah, the dog doesn't.
But he's really important because
Yeah.
they stayed alive long enough because
Yeah.
of
The
the
dog's also neutered. That should be remembered as well.
Yeah. So what did your table come up with, or what did you come up with?
Sorry, I'm just thinking about evolution of dog species now.
Oh no, that's a different book.
We were talking a little bit, I've been thinking a lot about the capacity for communication that humans have. And again, our conversation kind of goes tangential direction. That's probably most
We love-
discussions do.
Hey, that's all right.
And whether or not our capacity for communication is evolutionary, I think it's a disadvantage, especially in the era of the internet and social media. I mean, we see such havoc wreaked in, spheres like Twitter, and social media especially. But also, you were kind of questioning whether this capacity for communication is, an evolutionary way out for humans. Whether or not it's something that we want to hold on to. I think in Galapagos, for economic activity, like, no, it's not something you want to hold on to. We're going to get rid of that as much as possible. But I think judging on the fact that most of us don't want to be seals that don't communicate, that's something that I think people would hold on to as long as possible. It's just capacity for communication.
And that's something that you had mentioned in our talk, losing the storytelling and the culture.
And he does write a novel after all, right? That's a communicative act.
So all organisms communicate. They
Even
just do
plants?
it. Oh yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
They all communicate. They communicate through chemicals. We do too, but, we smell all kinds of things, right? You can recognize your partner because the way they smell or their clothes or something. So we all have that capacity to communicate through chemical information. If you get down in the ground, all these organisms down there are communicating with each other through chemical signals of different sorts. The bacteria is telling the plant, hey, I'm a good bacteria. You want me near your root. I'm not one of those bad guys that's going to come and kill you. There's this information exchange that's going on all the time. So communication is always going to be there no matter what happens. You may not write a novel about it, though.
But then there's communication that's detached from a purpose. In the novel, it's the Mandarax that spouts all these maxims that are often just detached from any kind of larger purpose. They're just there, like commonplace books, like quotes that we remember, like on calendars and things like that. Help yourself and heaven will help you, for example. That's one of those. So these are acts of communication that essentially go into a void, as far as the novel is concerned. And Vonnegut is saying, let's think about it differently. His novel is an act to communicate to us what we should do and how we should use our brains the right way, because it's the only hope we have.
Yeah.
Thinking about the idea, of course, all living things communicate with each other in one way or the other, but the majority of that communication is about survival, propagation. And I think, hopefully, like, speaking out of turn, I feel like where the conversation held up to our table was that leap into consciousness, self-awareness, communication for other purposes, and creation for other purposes is part of why we see it. And we like that about who we are. And it's hard to even conceive of the ability to get that.
No, it's absolutely. It is a hard thing to think about giving up. But, You know, there's lots of organisms out there that actually do entertain themselves. That, at least it seems that way to us. Like you see
Yeah.
cats playing with each other and so on. It's a survival tactic because it's training, preparing their muscles so that they can go and do that. But the ones that have the more playtime and that sort of thing are the ones that have pulled more resources out of the environment so that they don't have to constantly be going to get more stuff out of the environment. And that's where we differ because we have the energy to get anything we want.
That's great. I know we are short on time. Yeah, go ahead, Rufus.
So since this is a new group that might not have heard of books and grades before, two things that I might mention previous books that we've done to the idea of telling stories and really cultural storytelling. We did a workshop a couple of months ago. Yeah, 2 months ago or so, and really good sort of short stories of how to cultural narrative and read. And then Animal Madness is another book we did last year. It talks about those animals, the psychology behind them, and like ideas playing for fun, doing things that might not make sense on the front of it, but are very helpful activities for that relationship. So check out at Human Sciences to follow at Humanities, Humanities, not Humanities.
Yeah. No, good plug, because we have touched on a lot of these conversations in previous seasons of Books, Booze, and Brains. Because I mean, these running themes are obviously, and this is something that we talked about in our discussion. Although this book was written in 1986 and was poignant for its time, now is still very poignant. And there were multiple points, and I've said this already, that I had to put the book down, and I mentioned this in our discussion as well. Being a young woman in the era of reproductive rights, and then reading about the reproduction in a different lens, I had to stop because it hit too close to home, and I know that's something Vonnegut was aiming to do, as you mentioned in our discussion. It's a piece of fantasy. It's fantasy. It's made up, right? But it hits close to home. A lot of this, and it is so poignant now just as much as it was then. And we've hit on these themes before because they are so critically important. And that's why we do what we do. And so I know we are out of time, but I do want to give a few minutes for you all to ask our wonderful experts anything. If you had any questions about the book or about our discussion, happy to take a few of those while we have time. Yeah.
Yeah, the question I have is, from your respective areas of expertise, what do you make of the fact that this human story and the concepts of evolution and everything else and language are told to us by a ghost?
Yeah.
Something that's supernatural and removed from that change.
Roger, you want to start?
Yeah, I don't know. I like that idea.
Yeah.
But he was a very unusual ghost because he hadn't entered that blue tunnel, right? For a
Yes,
million years,
yeah,
he avoided
yeah,
the blue
yeah,
tunnel.
yeah.
So his whatever energy still existed, and so he was able to watch all this stuff. I just thought it was a really clever way to tell this story because it makes it more powerful in a way that, here's somebody who witnessed what we went through, but left out a lot of the really gory details that you don't want to know about. Like what happened to all the other people? They just disappeared, right? How did they disappear?
Yeah, yeah.
That couldn't have been pretty. I mean, we saw what happened on the dock with people getting shot and killed and, over food. And almost certainly that's going to be one of the impacts. That's what's happening around the planet right now. There's wars all over the place at all different scales, minor tribal thing, not minor, smaller tribal events up to the scales where you have a superpower that's trying to beat down, another poor country. And yeah, so I just love the idea that this ghost told the story. I mean, it made so much of it easier to read in many ways, because you weren't, here's my idea of what the future is. It's just like, no, I saw this future. This is a possibility. There's infinite possibilities, but that was the one that he picked. Yeah, I thought it was pretty cool.
It's a very practical thing to do, because as we talked about this before, how various levels, time levels intersect, and the ghost lives in the future, in the present, and the past, because he's a ghost. It's also Vonnegut making fun of narrative conventions. Think of all these omniscient narrators, and you don't really know where they're coming from. And he's really sort of literalizing this, my guy is not really substantial. It's a spectral presence, right, in the literal sense. And then this ghost acquires a history, which I think you